Racist bikers attacks black man, unaware he's a Navy SEAL. The road stretched out like an old scar under the searing southern sun, the asphalt cracked and shimmering with heat. Kevin Hart stood beside his car, hood up, engine lifeless, and silence so loud it almost felt like a taunt. He tapped his phone again, no signal. Just a single mocking bar flickering before vanishing. The wind carried the scent of dust, gasoline, and something faintly metallic, danger maybe. He rolled his shoulders once, loosening tight muscles under a clean, gray hoodie that clung to his solid frame. His boots were planted firm on the gravel, like roots refusing to be moved. Then in the distance, the growl of engines. 3 motorcycles thundered over the hill, chrome glinting like teeth in the sunlight. They moved in formation, tight, intentional. Like wolves closing in on a rabbit. Kevin didn't flinch. He stood tall beside the open hood, hand raised in casual signal. The bike slowed, then circled. One peeled left, the other right, the third stopped in front. Their leader, an older man with a bushy red beard and oil-stained jeans, kicked his boot down with a thud and took off his sunglasses. "You lost, boy," he drawled, not as a question but a warning. His voice was thick with scorn, each word dipped in venom. The second biker, lean and twitchy, grinned with tobacco-stained teeth and spat near Kevin's boots. The third, silent and barrel-chested, rested his hand near a rusted chain on his belt loop. None of them were here to help. They were here to hunt. Kevin offered a calm nod, voice even. "Car overheated. Just need a tow or a ride to the next gas station." His eyes didn't waver, didn't plead. He spoke with the kind of quiet that carried weight. The kind of quiet that made men underestimate him. Red chuckled, a hollow mean sound. "This ain't no Uber stop. Town's back that way." He jabbed a thumb behind him. "But I reckon folks there don't take kindly to your kind." Kevin tilted his head slightly. "Didn't ask for kindness. Just a little help." The lean one snorted. "Help? From us? You're lucky we ain't in the mood to decorate our bikes today." The third one finally spoke. "Let's go. He ain't worth the grease on our boots." But his eyes lingered. Cold, calculating. Watching Kevin the way you'd watch a fuse right before the spark. With a final sneer, Red mounted his bike. The engines roared to life again. They rode off, but not fast. Not far. Just far enough to pretend it was over. Kevin exhaled, slow and controlled, as the dust kicked up by their tires settled back to the earth. His fingers twitched slightly before curling back into fists and relaxing. He walked to the trunk, pulled out a small water bottle, and poured it carefully into the radiator, already knowing it wouldn't work. This car hadn't just overheated. It had given up, right here, in the middle of nowhere, like it knew the story needed tension. As he stood in the silence again, Kevin's mind scanned through his options. No signal. Nearest town, 5, maybe 6 miles back, judging by the sign he passed an hour ago. He'd walked farther under worse conditions. Hell, he'd crawled. But this wasn't a battlefield. Or maybe it was, just dressed in denim and bigotry instead of camo and rifles. He reached into the back seat, pulled out a worn canvas bag, and slung it over his shoulder. Inside, essentials. He always traveled ready, even when pretending to be just another guy on the road. The boots crunched gravel as he began walking, the sun bearing down like a challenge. He didn't look back, but the rumble of motorcycles echoed again. Louder now. Closer. He didn't turn around. Not yet. Let them think he was unaware. Let them get close. Because sometimes the trap wasn't in the confrontation. Sometimes, the trap was in assuming the man walking alone wasn't trained to kill. And Kevin Hart, Navy SEAL turned civilian ghost, had never forgotten how to fight. He just hadn't decided if this was the war yet. Not yet. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. The town of Briar's Hollow looked like it had been plucked straight from an old western and forgotten by time. One main street, one gas station, a diner with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying wasp. Kevin stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, sweat tracing a line down his spine, his footsteps echoing louder than expected in the sleepy stillness. He felt the weight of eyes before he even reached the door. Kevin walked to the counter, not looking for trouble, just food and a cold glass of water. The overhead fan spun lazily, failing to push the heat or the tension out of the room. He eased onto a stool, his presence swallowing the space like thunder before a storm. A young waitress, early 20s, blonde ponytail, apron dusted with flour, approached slowly, hesitantly. Her lips parted like she wanted to ask if he was lost, but something in Kevin's stillness made her rethink. "You, want a menu?" she asked, voice tight, eyes darting toward the back where an older man with arms like butcher slabs watched from the kitchen window. "Water. Cheeseburger. Fries," Kevin said simply. He didn't smile. Didn't frown either. Just looked at her the way a surgeon might study a patient, detached, calculating. She nodded quickly and walked away. Kevin's eyes scanned the diner, not frantically but thoroughly. A man in a plaid shirt shifted uncomfortably in a corner booth. An old woman with sun-spotted hands clutched her purse tighter. A teenager behind the counter stopped pretending to mop and stared openly. Kevin wasn't new to this dance. The slow, slithering kind of hate. The type that didn't always scream or swing first, but watched, whispered, and waited for permission. He'd seen it in other countries wearing different faces. But here, in America, it wore denim jackets and patriotic bumper stickers. His dog tags clinked lightly as he reached for the sweating glass of water placed in front of him. He caught the sound himself and instinctively tucked them back under his shirt. No one noticed, except the cook. His gaze narrowed at that flash of metal. Recognition flickered there. Not quite understanding, but suspicion. A man like Kevin didn't walk like he was lost. He walked like he had been found and survived it. As Kevin took a bite of the burger, the sound of engines revving outside stirred something deep. Familiar, ugly. The same trio of bikers rolled into view through the dusty front windows. Red, the leader, now without sunglasses, made direct eye contact with Kevin as he parked his bike right up on the sidewalk like he owned it. They dismounted slowly, theatrically, the sound of their boots scraping the pavement like a challenge. Kevin finished his last bite and placed the napkin gently on the counter. He didn't rush. Didn't flinch. The door swung open with a hollow jingle. The air thickened. Red and his crew stepped inside, bringing the stench of gasoline and arrogance with them. They didn't need to speak. Their posture said it all. They sauntered past booths, brushing shoulders, nodding at familiar faces. People looked away. One man left his coffee half full and walked out. "Well, look who made it into town," Red sneered, leaning an elbow on the counter just 2 stools away. His voice was low but pointed. "Didn't think you'd be the sit-down-and-order type. More like the run-along-home kind." Kevin didn't answer. He didn't look up. Just kept sipping water. "You deaf boy," the lean one snapped, stepping closer. Kevin finally turned, his gaze quiet, almost bored. "Just wondering if your engines are louder than your courage." The diner gasped, not loudly, but as a single, collective intake of breath. Red's smile faltered for half a second, then reappeared sharper. "You got a mouth on you. Let's see if it still works after you're chewing gravel." The waitress dropped a plate. Shattered china cut through the tension like a gunshot. Kevin stood slowly, calmly. Every motion was deliberate, rehearsed. He didn't raise his voice. "I asked for help. You offered a threat. That says more about you than me." The cook stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a stained rag, but said nothing. Just stood behind the counter like a judge waiting for the fight to start. Everyone waited. Red chuckled again, but there was something new in his laugh, uncertainty. Kevin's composure was too measured, too patient, like a man not just unafraid of violence, but familiar with it. "You know what?" Red said, backing up. "Maybe we'll catch up later. Private-like." His eyes glinted with something darker than anger. The bikers turned and walked out, but Kevin knew the game had just begun. They weren't done. They were waiting, planning. He stood there for a moment longer, the silence still thick, before turning back to the counter and tossing down a 20. He didn't look at the waitress. Didn't look at the cook. Just walked out into the sun, his shadow long behind him, unmoving, like a storm cloud that refused to pass. The road they took wasn't marked on any GPS. Cracked dirt gave way to loose gravel, weaving through thickets of pine and brush that whispered with the wind. Kevin sat in the sidecar of Red's chopper, his canvas bag clutched loosely in his lap, boots planted, mind still. Every instinct told him this was a mistake. Every lesson whispered the same thing: stay calm. Let them believe they've won. The air tasted like rust and smoke. The farther they rode, the more civilization faded into a memory. When they finally stopped, it was in a clearing behind a sagging dive bar and rusted junkyard. A rust-colored sign hung lopsided above the bar door, its letters faded and cracked. The Greasy Hog. Perfect name. Kevin stepped out of the sidecar slowly, surveying the area. 3 trucks, a trailer home, and the glint of broken bottles scattered in the weeds. No crowds. No cameras. Just them. Just him. Red turned to face him, grin wide and teeth yellowed with nicotine and hate. "Here we are, soldier boy. You said you needed help. Thought we'd offer some hands-on hospitality." The way he said it made Kevin's skin prickle, not from fear, but from patience burning at the edge of restraint. Kevin said nothing, just adjusted the strap of his bag and waited. The lean one, now visibly twitching with excitement, cracked his knuckles. "I say we teach this arrogant little monkey how. We handle outsiders around here." The third biker, silent and slow-moving, removed the chain from his belt loop and let it dangle, each clink sounding like a countdown. Red took a step closer, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "So what are you really? Huh? Cop? Fed? Some kind of activist? Or just another loudmouth from the city thinking he can strut around like he's better than us?" Kevin finally spoke, voice low, steady. "None of the above." Red leaned in, close enough to smell the sweat on Kevin's skin. "You talk a big game for a man standing alone." His smile widened. "But we ain't scared of talk. Ain't scared of skin either." The chain whipped through the air. Kevin moved. No one saw the first strike, just the sound of metal hitting the dirt and a choked gasp as the chain wielder's wrist twisted unnaturally beneath Kevin's grip. The man dropped, writhing, his chain now in Kevin's hand. One down. The lean one rushed him, fists clenched, but Kevin sidestepped with a dancer's precision and slammed an elbow into his temple. The man staggered. Kevin swept his legs with one kick, dropping him hard onto the gravel, then drove a boot into his gut for good measure. Two down. Red froze. His confidence cracked. Kevin turned to him slowly, expression unreadable, like a man reliving a muscle memory, not a confrontation. "You sure you want to be number 3? Red backed up a step, hand inching towards something behind his belt. A knife. A gun. Kevin didn't wait to find out. He closed the distance in 2 strides and struck, open palm to the sternum, then twisted the biker's arm behind his back and pinned him to the side of his own motorcycle. Kevin's voice, now a breath against Red's ear, was colder than steel. "You had your chance. Now you listen." Red struggled but was held firm, breath coming in ragged gasps. Kevin released him after a moment, letting him stumble backward, clutching his ribs. "I don't want your town. I don't want your trouble. I gave you respect. You spit it back." "That's your choice," Kevin said, tossing the chain onto the ground. It landed with a loud, final clang. "But don't think for a second that makes you a man." Red coughed, glaring. "What the hell are you?" he hissed. Kevin didn't answer. He just turned away, walking toward the dive bar's back exit, the sun catching the sweat on his brow and the faint glint of his dog tags as they bounced gently against his chest. He didn't run. He didn't look back, because he didn't need to. Inside, a few drunken patrons stirred at the sight of him emerging from the back lot, shirt streaked with dust and boots leaving prints across the warped floor. A bartender blinked, but said nothing. Kevin dropped a few bills on the bar and asked for a glass of water. He drank in silence, throat parched but not dry. Behind him, the door creaked open. No one entered. He was being watched again. Not by enemies, but by confusion. Fear. Curiosity. He welcomed it. Let the whispers begin. Because sometimes, the real warning doesn't come from shouting. It walks out of your own backyard with quiet footsteps, a storm wrapped in stillness, and leaves you wondering what it was that just passed through. Kevin Hart didn't need a weapon. He was one. And Briar's Hollow was about to find out exactly what kind. The sheriff's cruiser rolled up to the diner, just as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, bleeding gold across the sky like a wound slow to heal. Kevin sat on the porch swing of a nearby general store, sipping sweet tea that a stranger had handed him minutes earlier without a word. The town was quieter now. Hushed, like it was holding its breath. Sheriff Malcolm Rayburn stepped out of the vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel with deliberate slowness. Tall, wide, with a face like old bark, wrinkled and weather-worn. His belt creaked under the weight of authority and age. A man who had worn the same uniform for decades and believed the town wore it with him. "You Kevin Hart?" he asked, voice low but carrying the weight of someone used to obedience. Kevin didn't rise. Just looked up from his tea, eyes steady. "That's me." Rayburn nodded once, almost respectfully. "Heard you had a run-in behind the greasy hog. 3 boys say you ambushed them. Said you pulled a weapon." Kevin's brow didn't lift, didn't twitch. "I didn't pull anything but restraint. The fight came to me. I just ended it." Rayburn chewed on that, then let out a long breath and sat on the bench across from him, the wood creaking like it disapproved of the weight of the moment. "Let me be honest with you, son," the sheriff said, not looking directly at him. This town, it doesn't like change. Doesn't trust outsiders. Especially ones that can outfight 3 grown men like it's breakfast. Kevin finally smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've eaten worse meals. The sheriff almost chuckled but caught himself. I read between the lines. Red and his boys? Not exactly citizens of the year. I've had complaints. Drunken brawls, threats. But no one's ever laid them out flat like that. You made a statement whether you meant to or not. Kevin leaned forward slightly. What kind of statement? That Briar's Hollow ain't untouchable. That maybe there's someone out there who doesn't care about our shadows, Rayburn said. Then he paused. They're embarrassed. And that kind of man, once humiliated, tends to escalate. Kevin nodded slowly. Let them. The sheriff looked at him now, really looked. Studied the calm on his face. The silence around his shoulders. He saw something he hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not even defiance, discipline. The kind forged through fire and carried by ghosts. He stood up, brushing dust off his pants. I don't want more blood in this town, he said firmly. If you stay, you'll need to keep a low profile. Let this die down. Kevin rose too, eyes now level with the lawman. I don't start fights. I end them. The sheriff nodded once and walked back to his cruiser. But the way he glanced in his rearview mirror told Kevin everything he needed to know. Rayburn believed him. But belief wouldn't stop what was coming. That night, Kevin returned to the small motel on the edge of town. A crooked vacancy, sign buzzing erratically in neon green. Room 6. Sparse. 1 bed. 1 fan. 1 old Bible left on the nightstand, like it could keep the devil away. He sat on the edge of the bed, unzipped his bag, and pulled out a folded photograph, creased in the corners from years of travel. A young woman and a child smiled back at him. He brushed a thumb over their faces, then returned the photo to the hidden compartment beneath the canvas lining. He was here for a reason, though he hadn't spoken it aloud, not even to himself. Outside, a motorcycle passed slowly. Then another. Their engines were quieter now. Not revving. Creeping. The sound didn't make his blood rush, it made it still. Kevin walked to the window and peered out from behind the curtain. A single biker idled near the gas station across the street. Helmet on. Head unmoving. A shadow waiting for darkness to finish the job. Kevin turned off the lights and moved into the center of the room, where no window could silhouette him. He crouched, opened the floor vent, and slid out a compact case wrapped in military canvas. Inside, not a weapon, but a file. Names. Maps. Pictures of Red and his gang. It wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a wrong turn. Kevin hadn't stumbled onto Briar's Hollow. He'd come hunting. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. The air outside smelled of pine and revenge, sharp, earthy, and waiting to ignite. Kevin stepped into the moonlight without fear, his every motion deliberate, unhurried. The biker across the street hadn't moved in 5 minutes, but Kevin wasn't fooled. Stillness could be a mask. In war zones, it often was. That kind of stillness usually meant surveillance. Or bait. He crossed the parking lot barefoot, silent as breath. The night gave him cover, and he moved like it owed him something. As he approached the gas station, the rider's head finally turned. Slow. Mechanical. Kevin didn't break stride. You lost? He asked, stopping 10 feet away. No answer. The helmet reflected moonlight, making the rider look more machine than man. Kevin studied the angle of the shoulders, the slope of the back. Too still. Too stiff. His eyes flicked down. The boots didn't match the rest of the gear. Old steel toes. Worn leather. Not riding boots, work boots. Staged. And in that second, he realized the biker wasn't watching him. The biker was the distraction. Kevin spun on instinct just as something whistled through the air. A pipe missed his skull by an inch. He grabbed the attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisting, forcing a grunt of pain from the man behind him. A second attacker lunged from the shadows. Kevin dropped low, sweeping his leg across the gravel, knocking them off balance. They hit the ground hard. 3 more shapes emerged from behind the gas station, all shadows and rage. Red wasn't among them, but his fingerprints were all over this ambush, sloppy, spiteful, and cowardly. Kevin pivoted, throwing the first man into the path of the others, buying a heartbeat of space. He ducked a punch, delivered one of his own, and felt bone crack under his knuckles. The 4th man came from behind with a tire iron. Kevin spun, caught the arm mid-swing, and used the attacker's momentum to flip him over his shoulder. Breathing hard, Kevin stood in the center of the chaos, surrounded by groaning bodies and scattered weapons. He wasn't untouched, a cut above his brow, a bruise forming on his rib. But he was standing. The helmeted rider remained unmoving. Kevin walked over and yanked the helmet off. A mannequin head stared back, lifeless plastic grinning in the dark. His jaw clenched. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about humiliation. Fear. They wanted to rattle him, chip away at his calm. But they'd made a fatal mistake. They thought they were the hunters. They didn't realize he had been tracking them from the start. He left the bodies where they lay and disappeared into the trees, moving like a shadow swallowed by the forest. The town behind him would soon wake to rumors, another skirmish, another mystery. But Kevin had no time for whispers. His destination wasn't the motel. It was the cabin. Nestled deep in the woods, away from any trail, the cabin looked like it had been built by ghosts. Rotting logs, boarded windows, overgrown path. But inside, it was far from abandoned. Maps lined the walls, each marked with red pins. Photos of Red's crew, years' worth of activity from different towns, all pointing to the same thing, a pattern. Kevin lit a single lantern. On the desk lay a document with the Department of Defense seal. Operation Iron Shadow. The mission he'd buried in the past. His team had been tasked with dismantling a smuggling network rooted in rural America. Drugs, weapons, even stolen military tech. The trail had gone cold, until Red's crew surfaced again, flashing familiar tactics in a quiet town like Briar's Hollow. They weren't just racist thugs with bikes. They were the ghosts of something bigger, something darker. And Kevin wasn't here by accident. He was the cleanup. He ran his finger down a list of names. 5 left. Red was at the top. Not because he was the most dangerous, but because he was the loudest. The others operated in silence. Men like the sheriff may have known, maybe even looked the other way. But Kevin had seen this disease spread before. He wasn't going to let it take root again. A branch snapped outside. Kevin froze, hand inching toward the drawer where he kept the suppressor and sidearm. Another step. Too careful for an animal. He extinguished the lantern and waited in the dark. Calm. Ready. Because the game had shifted. And this time, he was laying the trap. The silence inside the cabin was heavy, so thick it pressed against Kevin's chest like invisible weight. He didn't move. Didn't breathe loud enough to betray his location. Years of combat had taught him the art of stillness, not just as survival but as dominion. Outside, the footsteps grew closer. Slow. Cautious. Not the thunderous stomp of Red's crew. This was someone trained. Controlled. A ghost among ghosts. Then a faint whisper, leaves brushing against denim, the dry snap of a twig beneath a careful heel. Kevin slid silently across the wooden floor until his back touched the wall beside the front door. One hand on the sidearm, the other on the old hunting knife lodged between 2 floorboards. Another step. Closer now. Whoever was out there wasn't bluffing. Suddenly the door creaked inward. Kevin struck. In one fluid motion, he wrenched the door open and slammed the figure against the outer wall. His forearm pressed against the intruder's throat, knife raised, but stopped short at the sight of her face. Not Red. Not a biker. A woman. Young. Maybe early 30s. Sharp eyes, freckled nose, no fear in her expression. She didn't struggle. Just stared at him like she knew exactly who he was. Easy, she said, her voice gravelly but calm. I'm not with them. Kevin didn't move the knife, but he loosened his grip. Who are you? My name's Claire Reddick. I'm a journalist, she said. Investigative. I've been following Red and his crew for over a year. I know what they really are. And I know who you are. Kevin's eyes narrowed. You've been following me? No, she replied. I've been following the blood trail. And it led me here. To Briar's Hollow. And to you. He studied her a moment longer before lowering the knife. She rubbed her neck where he'd pinned her, but didn't complain. He stepped back, allowing her inside. She took in the cabin with one glance, then walked straight to the map-covered wall. You've been tracking them, she said, more a statement than a question. I don't track trash, Kevin muttered. I burn it. She turned, gaze sharp. They're not just trash. They're trafficking weapons. Disguised as a hate group, but there's deeper funding. Military-grade arms. Ghost shipments. You know that. That's why you're here. He didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. Claire stepped closer. I think we're chasing the same beast. But I can't finish this alone. You're the only one who's ever gotten close enough to draw blood. Kevin crossed his arms. This isn't a story. It's a war. You're not equipped. Her voice dropped. My brother was one of them. Not by choice. He disappeared 6 months ago. Last I heard, he was meeting Red's men in Ashe County. I found his truck burned. His tags were nailed to a tree. Her breath hitched. So no, I'm not here for a headline. Something shifted in Kevin. A faint nod. A silent acknowledgement of shared grief. Shared purpose. All right, he said. Then listen close. He laid the mission out like a battle plan, because that's what it was. Red wasn't the final boss. He was the smokescreen. The crew was part of a pipeline running guns to militias out west. They used fear and race as the camouflage. Hide behind hate, and nobody looks too closely at the money. 3 nights from now, Red and the others were planning a shipment. A warehouse outside of town, disguised as an abandoned sawmill. Kevin had already scouted it, found a weakness in their security rotation. It was time to go in. Claire scribbled notes, then paused. And the sheriff? Kevin's jaw tightened. Still watching. Still choosing silence. Claire tucked her pen behind her ear. Then we expose him too. He looked at her, and for the first time since he arrived in Briar's Hollow, he didn't feel completely alone. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees like a warning. Or a promise. The war was no longer just his. It had a witness now. A firestorm was coming. And this time, they would be the ones caught in the crosshairs. The night smelled like sawdust and gasoline, raw, industrial, and angry. Kevin crouched on a rusted catwalk above the old sawmill floor, watching shadows move beneath him. The warehouse was alive with motion, men hauling crates, loading trucks, laughing too loud to hide the nerves beneath their swagger. The smell of gun oil drifted up through the beams. Everything reeked of war, disguised as business. Claire was in position across the lot, hidden in a dilapidated office with a camera rig strapped to her chest and a tiny mic feeding into Kevin's earpiece. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She had proven herself over the last 2 days, digging into records, finding back routes, even hacking into the sheriff's logs to confirm what Kevin suspected. The man had been redacting calls about Red's crew for over a year. They weren't just tolerated in Briar's Hollow. They were protected. Kevin's eyes locked on Red. The man swaggered across the floor in his sleeveless vest, a Confederate flag patch stitched over one shoulder, beer in hand, barking orders like a sergeant in a forgotten war. Kevin felt no hatred, only precision. A Navy SEAL didn't operate on emotion. He moved with purpose. Tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. Claire's voice crackled in his ear. We've got video on the tags. Serial numbers visible. This connects them to the missing weapons out of Fort Harlan. That's our smoking gun. Copy that, Kevin whispered, already descending the catwalk. He landed behind a stack of crates and moved silently between them. His boots touched down like feathers. In his hand was a collapsible baton, tucked inside a reinforced glove. No gun. Not yet. Noise was the enemy for now. 2 guards stood near the exit, distracted by their own jokes. Kevin slipped behind one, hooked an arm around his neck, and brought him down without a sound. The second turned too late. Kevin drove his palm into the man's throat, sending him crumpling like a paper doll. He dragged the bodies behind a column and checked his watch. Claire had 5 minutes to transmit the footage to the journalist contact she'd arranged in D.C. After that, there were no guarantees. He pressed forward toward the loading bay where Red barked louder now, growing agitated. Kevin peeked around a stack of crates and spotted him pacing near the back door, flanked by 2 lieutenants, heavily armed, twitchy. Kevin stepped into the open. Red saw him instantly. The smile that curled across his face was pure malice. Well, look who crawled out of the swamp, Red said, raising his arms like a preacher welcoming a prodigal son. I was hoping you'd show. Figured you'd want a front row seat to our little operation. Kevin didn't flinch. This ends tonight. Red's smile deepened. You think you're the first ghost to haunt us? We burn ghosts round here, boy. Behind Kevin, footsteps closed in. Claire's voice hissed in his ear. 2 more behind you. Armed. Kevin exploded into motion. He ducked, rolled, and came up swinging. The baton cracked against a jaw. A pistol fired, a deafening clap in the cavernous room, but missed. Kevin grabbed a wooden pallet and drove it into one attacker's chest, pinning him to the wall. The room erupted. Shouts. Gunfire. Men scattering like rats in the light. Claire emerged from the office, camera still rolling, yelling to get the attention of the men still not shooting. The whole thing's live. You're being recorded. Some froze. Others didn't care. One raised a rifle. Kevin tackled him, drove him into the floor, and heard the rifle clatter away. Red vanished behind a rolling metal door at the back of the warehouse. Kevin took off after him. The chase spilled into the woods behind the mill. The moon was high now, washing the forest in silver light. Red crashed through branches ahead, panting hard. Kevin followed without hesitation. Finally Red turned, pulling a knife from his boot. "You want it, Navy boy," he growled. "Come get it." Kevin didn't speak. He advanced, dodged the first swing, caught Red's wrist, and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. The knife fell. They struggled in the dirt, fists flying, but Red was clumsy with rage. Kevin moved with the calm of someone who'd fought in sandstorms, in jungles, on rooftops soaked in blood. He pinned Red down, breathing hard. "This is for everyone you buried in silence." Police sirens wailed in the distance. Claire had done it. The footage was out. The sheriff's hand was forced. The whole town would know. Red looked up at him, dazed. You ain't one of us." Kevin stared down at him. "I never was." By the time the sheriff arrived, Kevin was already gone. So was Claire. The warehouse burned in the distance, lighting up the night like a funeral pyre. In a motel 2 towns over, Kevin watched the breaking news. Illegal arms trafficking ring exposed in small southern town. Suspected links to domestic militias. Sheriff under investigation. Multiple arrests made. He turned off the TV, opened his bag, and placed Claire's camera inside. Then pulled out the photograph of the woman and child once more. He smiled, faint but real this time. Justice hadn't come with sirens or medals. It came in silence, one mission at a time. And Briar's Hollow would never be the same again.